This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. The practice of jus prima noctis, right of the first night, is, in its simplest terms, the right of the local noble to deflower local peasant brides on their wedding night before their newlywed husbands. Precedence for this practice supposedly goes back for many thousands of years, with the first reference of something like it going all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh from over 4,000 years ago. This practice apparently reached its crescendo during the Middle Ages in Europe and today is popularly depicted in Hollywood films such as Braveheart. But did it ever really happen? Well, fortunately for peasant brides and their husbands, it turns out there is no solid evidence of this practice happening in reality at all. There is not a single well-documented incident recorded, nor a single victim's name passed down. It could be argued that women in these periods in general would not be considered noteworthy, especially peasant women, but with a practice spanning supposedly thousands of years and the presumable rage it would induce in the peasant populace, not to mention occasional bastard offspring and perhaps a boatload of secret weddings to avoid the issue, odds are at least a few documented cases would manage to make it down through posterity. Or even just a record of the law in some court case, as there are such records of numerous other laws. But any such evidence simply doesn't exist outside of fictional works or, for instance, cases where people were trying to rally the peasant class against their lords using the supposedly former practice of jus prima noctis to whip the mob up. In fact, in the very first mention of this in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we see the hero Enkidu, who was sent by the gods to stop Gilgamesh after the people cried out to the gods for aid, physically blocking a wedding place to challenge Gilgamesh over this appalling abuse of power. In another early account, in the 5th century BC, Heraclides Ponticus describes how the king of the island of Cephalonia instituted this practice. Once again, the commoners weren't pleased, and one man went ahead and dressed himself as a bride and subsequently murdered the king when the monarch tried to exercise his lordly right. For his efforts, the cross-dressing man was made the new king by the overjoyed masses. There's also the matter of disease to consider. While these girls were all supposedly virgins on their wedding day, that didn't mean they were free from diseases that frequently devastated life through most of history. And let's face it, these lords weren't just sleeping with these women, but many others to boot. If the lords were truly sleeping with many or all of these women in their little fiefdoms beyond spreading disease to every corner of their lands, jus prima noctis would have been a deadly law for a lord of a fiefdom of any real size, assuming he chose to take advantage of it. So it should come as no surprise then that while it is possible there exists a few rulers in history who actually tried something like this at some point, as mentioned, most historians think the vast majority of accounts are pure fiction or exaggeration. For instance, Louis Veuillot, writing in France during the 19th century, stated, "Nothing, absolutely nothing in the archives of justice authorizes us to say that our forefathers ever made a crime into a law. If we search the evidence and the literature, we find the same silence everywhere. The Middle Ages had never heard of the droit du seigneur, aka jus prima noctis." Other European scholars shared Veuillot's opinion. Germany's Carl Schmitt penned a thorough treatise on jus prima noctis in 1881 and came to the conclusion that it was a learned superstition. Over and over again, historians from then to now have tried to find hard evidence of this occurring, and they've come up empty, despite the numerous accounts, sometimes explicitly fictional and other times thought to be, throughout written history in nearly every major culture. For instance, famed philosopher Hector Boyce in the 16th century described this practice perfectly during the reign of Scottish King Evanus III and claimed the practice went on for centuries. It turns out, though, no such king ever existed, and much of Boyce's accounts concerning many of the legendary kings of Scotland are thought to be pure fiction. Similar fictional trends are seen elsewhere concerning this supposed law. So back to Europe and the Middle Ages. What is true is that in many feudal societies, peasants were required to get permission from their lord to marry. This requirement was called the collegium. This often involved payment of a fee to be granted such permission. Some claim this law replaced jus prima noctis, but while there is hard evidence of the collegium, not so much with jus prima noctis as mentioned. Besides an extra source of revenue, another purpose of the collegium was the nobles safeguarding their investment by making sure they didn't lose their valuable serfs to a neighboring lord for nothing. In essence, jus prima noctis, in some cases, functioned as a tax due when a serf's daughter married a man not on the lord's estate. By requiring the tax, it also made it easier to track such movements in the populace, as well as perhaps deny it when prudent. In addition, in some areas, the church also demanded payment of a fee to get the couple out of a 3-day waiting period before consummating their union. One can only imagine how they tracked that one. During that 3-day waiting period, the betrothed were supposed to be deep in prayer to prepare themselves fully for their physical and spiritual union. Of course, pay off your local clergy and you could go forth with a clear conscience. In the end, let's face it, life was brutal for peasants, and especially peasant women in this era. When they weren't being wiped out by some pandemic, humiliation and subjugation were just accepted facts of life for those born into the lower social orders. Jus prima noctis or not, female serfs were at the mercy of their lords and others who really didn't need an excuse, a law, or a wedding to rape or assault these serfs inhabiting their land, as we go into in a lot more detail in our video, Did Any Medieval Knight Ever Actually Rescue a Damsel in Distress? The peasant class didn't appreciate all this, or many other such abuses, one bit, and so it's no surprise that they would rally around a concept like jus prima noctis during various uprisings and instances of political discourse. In slightly more modern times, this was, for instance, a favorite weapon against nobility and clergy used by the great Enlightenment thinker Voltaire. Voltaire also, incidentally, made his fortune by helping to rig the lottery. As J.Q.C. Mackerel states in his book Attack on Feudalism in the 18th Century France, the philosophies used the droit jus prima noctis as a ploy to exaggerate the spectre of oppressed serfs. For them, no charge was too absurd. It should be noted here that at this time in France, it was also said that lords used to claim the right of droit de parlissement, right of lounging. This was the right of a lord to use one of his subjects' entrails, freshly ripped from the body, to warm the noble's feet. No charge too absurd indeed. And you know where there are no absurd charges? That would be with today's sponsor, Squarespace. Sponsors like Squarespace really do make what we do here every single day possible. So, if you've thought about getting a website, the smart move is to do it with Squarespace. Squarespace allows you to create a powerful online identity for yourself, your brands, or your business. Now, it all starts on Squarespace with a beautiful template that you can just go ahead and customize to your little heart's content. Or you can start from scratch, or you can easily move over from an existing domain. And on Squarespace, things are just easier to manage. And once you've gone through the super easy customization process, well, there's good news. There's no updates. There's no patches. There's no technical BS that you have to deal with. No one likes technical BS. And Squarespace, they also handle all of the website-y stuff, podcasts, oh yes, mailing lists, absolutely, social integrations, of course. They've also got 24/7 customer support who are there to help you whenever you've got a question. Squarespace isn't just about an online presence. You can also totally sell stuff on a Squarespace site. Look, if you're looking to start a business, pursue a dream, do it with Squarespace. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you are ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/brainfood and you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Again, thanks to Squarespace. Link below, and let's get into those bonus facts. Contrary to popular belief in the Western world, while there certainly are exceptions, particularly many among the royals, women in medieval times did not commonly get married before the age of 18. That said, it was technically allowed. For example, the Catholic Church had rules for just about everything, and one of its most authoritative texts was the Decretum Gratiani. This was written by the jurist Johannes Gratian in the 12th century, and it set a minimum age for betrothal, not necessarily marriage, at 7 years for boys and and girls, and the lawful age for a woman to consent to marriage, and as they called it, carnal intercourse, at 12, although certain unusual circumstances would render marriages at younger ages valid as well. Gratian was followed by others, including Hostiensis, who opined that a young woman's physical development, not her age, should determine whether she was ready for marriage. So this all might lead you to believe that the popular idea in the Western world that it was common for girls of this era to get married young is correct. However, although medieval marriages could legally occur at ages as young as 12, that doesn't seem to have been the norm. As stated in Kim Phillips's book Medieval Maidens, Young Women and Gender in England, while marriages at very young ages could and sometimes did take place, particularly for girls of high social status, it would be a mistake to see marriage below or around the age of puberty as the norm, even for young noblewomen. Emerging evidence is eroding the stereotype with work on low and lower middle status women, showing that a large proportion of the sample married between the ages of 18 and 22, and showing that urban girls in Yorkshire tended to marry in their early to mid-20s and rural girls in their late teens to early 20s. So what about later? A study performed by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, on marriage in North America and Western Europe mirrors the findings of the Yorkshire researcher. The NBER found that young women from the 17th through 19th centuries were not all that young when they got married. For example, in Massachusetts, records dating from 1652 to 1800 demonstrate that the mean age of first marriage for ladies was between 19.5 and 22.5 years, and records for other colonies reflect similar ages. In fact, the average age of first marriage for all the colonies studied was 19.8 before 1700, 21.2 during the early 18th century, and 22.7 during the late 18th century. This is consistent with data gathered in England, France, and Germany that puts the average mean age of first marriage for women at 25.1 from 1750 to 1799 and 25.7 from 1800 to 1849. Maintaining the trend by the end of the 19th century, the median age when women were first getting married was between 22 and 24 years old, and this tendency continued into the 1940s. In fact, the lowest median age for marriage since the early 1700s was had by the baby boomer generation, where the age dropped to 20.5 years in 1950. Perhaps unsurprisingly from this, the baby boomer generation also appears to have set the peak for high divorce rates. More on that in just a minute. But what about today? As of 2010, the median age of first marriage for women was 26.1 and 28.2 for men, although research demonstrates that marriage is most often delayed rather than foregone, and although they may wait a while, more than 90% of women will eventually marry. So let's go back to divorce. While you'll often read that there is a 50% chance of any marriage ending in divorce, this isn't quite accurate, or at least doesn't tell the whole story. It also only looks at the raw figures of marriage each year versus the number of divorces. This doesn't take into account repeat divorcees, which skews the total in any given year. In fact, 67% of second marriages and 73% of third marriages end in divorce. The average divorce rate for first marriages is only about 41% in the United States, and these divorce rate figures have been declining significantly in the last few decades, reaching their peak in the 1970s and early 1980s. It should also be noted that marriages where both partners have a college degree only end in divorce about 25% of the time. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below, and also click that link to go over to Squarespace and get started with a website. It supports the show, it's a good thing to do, and thank you for watching.